Okay, I have a picture of Churchill up now. So it's June of 1940. World War II in Europe has started, although we know it's already started. World War II started in China. Hitler and Stalin are still have their non-aggression pact in play. They've divided up Poland between them. Hitler's captured France and the countries north of France. He's also captured portions of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia. He thinks he's won the war. But what he doesn't know and what surprises him is that Britain will continue the fight. Um, Hitler always admired the British. He thought that he could bring the British to the table. And he's shocked. He never really is able to figure out why the British don't just admit that they've been defeated. And partially this is true is that there were elements in the British upper class and the ruling elite that were willing to negotiate with Hitler. And if you saw that movie, gosh, I can't remember the name now, the Gary Oldman movie, I'm sure a lot of you saw it. You had, there were high ups, elites in Great Britain that were quite sympathetic to Hitler, in part because they feared Stalin. They thought Stalin was far more dangerous, and that they were willing to work with Hitler. And so even the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, um, he wanted the British to negotiate with Hitler because he thought Hitler had won the war. So what Hitler runs into, he runs into a brick wall, Winston Churchill, and also the British people. Okay, Winston Churchill is a very complicated figure. In many respects, he lost most of the battles that he fought. Um, Historians of India hate him with a passion, and because he's a colonialist, he wanted to hold on to India. He's quite a controversial figure, but he did one thing historically right that we should all be very grateful for. He recognized the evil that was Adolf Hitler. And in a way, his willingness to stand up to Hitler and to denounce Hitler all throughout the 1930s, even when the British Prime Minister Chamberlain was still trying to appease Hitler, it just shows how marginalized Churchill had become by the 1930s. He changed parties, he's very unpopular, he was mistrusted among many, but he constantly is very consistent, gives a very consistent message that Hitler's a danger, he denounces Hitler. And after the fall of France, what you have is the British Army miraculously is saved at Dunkirk. What happens, the British Army had gone into the continent, had been defeated, goes to Dunkirk, and about 350,000 British soldiers are transported across the channel from Dunkirk back to Great Britain. It's a retreat, it's a strategic retreat, it's a loss really, but the army still lived to fight another day. Hugely important moment when the British Army, which had gone into the continent to fight Hitler, is able to be removed from the continent and brought back to Great Britain. And there's that other great movie, which I think is called Dunkirk, that tells that story. Kind of interesting how these World War II stories are out there. That's a pretty good movie, I think. The one with Churchill, with Gary Oldman, I thought it was a great performance. I wasn't wild about the movie, but anyway. So what happens? Churchill comes into power. He's a very experienced politician. He'd been around for decades, and he comes back into the British government, and he becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain. But as the Gary Oldman movie shows, there were elements in the British ruling party, especially Lord Halifax, that wanted Churchill, that wanted the British to negotiate with the Germans and make peace with the Germans. And Hitler actually has to maneuver around Halifax and get his cabinet to agree not to negotiate with the Germans. Halifax is trying to set up a go-between with the Italian ambassador, and Halifax is actually open to a negotiation with Hitler. And Halifax was almost as powerful as Churchill and could have easily been prime minister, but he turned it down for reasons that no one's completely clear about to this very day. Churchill becomes prime minister. Thank God that Halifax turned it down. And to talk about the sympathy for Hitler and the British ruling class, think about King George, who stepped down in 1930 because he married Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee. He was, in his circle, were fairly sympathetic to Hitler. And the king that came in, who's Queen Elizabeth's father, boy, Queen Elizabeth's been around for a long time. It's kind of incredible if you think about it. She still's going strong, looks like. He came in and he was very opposed to Hitler. So anyway, you have elements, very powerful elements in the British ruling class that are willing to deal with Hitler. But Churchill says, no, this is ridiculous. Hitler's not going to give us anything. He's just going to take us over. Like, he's going to promise us that he's going to give us autonomy, but he's a liar. You can't trust him. So what you had in the spring of 1940 is Churchill convinces his cabinet and the British government to keep fighting the war against Hitler. An incredible moment in the history of the West. Hitler's very frustrated. He plans an invasion of Great Britain, but it's hard to invade Great Britain, although the Allies went the other way 4 years later. It doesn't work for him. The head of his Air Force, Hermann Goering, promises Hitler that the British can be defeated just through the Air Force, that there's an air campaign that's launched against Great Britain in the fall of 1940, which is pretty devastating, but air power is almost always oversold. And in the Battle of Britain, the British Air Force is able to turn the German Air Force back. By the way, you might have noticed this in the movie Dunkirk. The British Air Force wasn't really involved in Dunkirk because the British military was holding the Air Force back. And there's a statue of the British Air Commander in London. I saw it last year, and it talks about how brilliant he was in holding the Air Force back to fight the onslaught from Hitler from the air beginning in September 1940. The other thing the British had, they had the invention of radar by this time, so it's another example of how the technology of the West helped defeat the Germans. That you're reading about this in the Monday book now. So Hitler stands alone against Great Britain. The Battle of Britain is a victory for the British. The Germans are not able to defeat the British by air. And it's at this point that Hitler makes his fatal mistake, and he decides to invade the Soviet Union. He's stymied by Great Britain. He's captured most of Europe, both East and West. He has an empire in Europe, but the British are holding out. And under Churchill's leadership, thank heavens, the British are fighting alone. And this is the other thing to remember. The Americans are not, the cavalry's not arriving yet. June of 1940 is almost 6 months before Pearl Harbor. Now, Roosevelt, as I'll talk about in another lecture, is able to help Churchill by sending him supplies, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. But in effect, Churchill is fighting alone. Now, Churchill does have some cards to play. There's the British Empire is very significant still. If worse comes to worse, he could have retreated to Canada. So he has resources to fight. But it's true, he was hoping and waiting for the United States to get involved in the war. But the key point, what I'll leave you with, Churchill's refusal, Great Britain's refusal to surrender to Hitler, even though Hitler is sure that the war is won, forces Hitler to turn to Russia because he feels like Russia can be defeated pretty easily because its generals have been decapitated. Remember, Russia had gone into Finland and done a horrible job fighting against the Finns in the early part of 1940. So Hitler, like the Japanese in China, Hitler thinks that he can kick the door in the Soviet Union and that he can defeat the Soviet Union very quickly. This in turn will force Great Britain to surrender. So Great Britain's refusal to surrender forces Hitler into what he had feared, a two-front war. Once again, we'll end with where we started. Hitler was not a great strategist. His decision to invade Russia, although it had a certain kind of logic of its own, that by defeating Russia, you'd force Britain out of the war, was extremely flawed, and it was probably the worst decision that he made, and it led to his ultimate defeat. Because, as was true of the Japanese and China, but even more so because the Soviet Union was a much stronger power than China, when Hitler went into the Soviet Union, although initially he moved pretty quickly and pretty deep into the interior of the Soviet Union, he bit off more than he could chew. He bit off more than he could chew. And this will ultimately be the major factor leading to his defeat.